I'm here with Arnold Newman in his New York City studio. Arnold, I've admired his work, the beauty and the sensitivity he's caught in his portraits, and the incredible composition over the years. And I've had the good fortune in the last few years to become friendly with Arnold and get closer to knowing him and his wife. Arnold, I want to thank you very much for having me at the studio, and I want to ask you a few questions about your career. First of all, let me ask you and start off in saying, when was the first time you ever picked up a camera? How old were you?
I was 20 years old, and I had just taken a job. This was the middle of the Depression in 1938. And all my friends in Philadelphia went to what was then called the School of Industrial Arts, which is one of the oldest art schools in America. And it's now called the University of the Arts, which includes a lot of the other art. Now teaches dance, theater, music, other art forms, as well as painting, sculpture, photography. But at that time, it was pretty well limited to photography, art, and textiles. And when I accepted the job, because I could no longer go to school, it was the middle of the Depression, my father lost all his money in the banks. It was a very common story then. I accepted this position to learn photography, doing 49-cent photographs, and I was earning $16 a week. But all my friends had just graduated. It was an incredible group. It all studied together under Brodovich.
And who were your other friends in that class?
The people in that group were people like Ben Rose, Saul Mednick, Victor Tresov, Irving Penn, and go on and on. There was a group who were all together, and Morris Bird, who became a teacher there in painting. And I would spend my nights. I took the job thinking I would continue to study art at night. But a few days after I got there, they all went out taking pictures. We all stayed up all night. I was just watching. And I just caught fire with me. This is a very exciting form of art. And I borrowed a camera from an uncle of mine, with 1920 Contessa metal and that sort of thing, with a fixed lens. But it did have a certain amount of movement, and I would start going out to take pictures. And some of the first pictures I did that very first day are now in museums. But then it was just my whole art background prepared me. And as soon as I went out, I understood the difference between painting, what was in front of me, and photographing what was in front of me. One of them was creative distortion, the other was creative selection. And I understood that immediately. And so I've been pretty lucky. I had the right teachers at the University of Miami and the right people I could kibitz with in Philadelphia. It was like a postgraduate course. And from there on in, it was all photography.
Arnold, then at that time, what were your influences in photography?
Well, actually, it began with painting. I wanted to be a painter ever since I could remember. I painted even as a child. And what was so wonderful was even in the depths of the Depression, my parents would scrounge up enough money to give me art lessons. And then I got this scholarship at the University of Miami, and I was able to continue for 2 years working 2 shifts, 8 to 12, taking free buses out to Coral Gables from Miami Beach and that sort of thing. But the real influences was, of course, the teachers who taught us the history of art. And outside the classrooms, there was all this wonderful stuff that were just beginning to be shown and accepted. It had been in America: Picasso, Braque, Matisse, Mondrian, Chagall, and there were so many things. And in the Life magazine, which was very important in those days, was beginning to show them. And when I got into photography, when I got to Philadelphia, I also was aware of Stiglitz, Steichen, Strand, the Farm Security Administration, which I almost became part of. But it was too late. They were just breaking up when I was introduced to Roy Stryker, who headed it. So there were so many influences that not one single one overpowered me in the sense of being an influence. So I absorbed from all of these great artists, photographers as well as painters. And I learned a great deal that way, besides on my own studying the history. What's more important was I began to meet them when I came to New York in 1941. And I was determined. I was offered a job. The Museum of Modern Art discovered me when I was back in 1941, Beaumont New Hall. And he sent me over the same day to see Stieglitz, who also discovered me and took me in. And I used to go back to see him frequently. But I had to go back to Miami Beach because the draft board was calling me. Unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever you want to look at it, the Army didn't take me. There was an overabundance of 18-year-olds, and I was a borderline case. And so I stayed in Miami Beach, came north to continue, and at the time, in June, I was offered an exhibit the day after Beaumont and Stieglitz took me in for Ben Rose, who was my childhood chum in Atlantic City, who went to this school. They all studied under Brodovich, by the way, the great Brodovich, the greatest teacher of photography.
Who became a great art director.
Well, he was an art director also at that time, already at Harper's Bazaar. And I start having ideas about doing portraiture because I was working in these inexpensive places where the camera, the lights, and even the posing bench was practically nailed down. You couldn't move them really, and there was the same old background. So you couldn't tell the difference between a CEO, a man who owned a factory in a town, and maybe the foreman on one of the assembly lines would get all dressed up and get his picture taken, and you couldn't tell who was the owner and who was the foreman. And I realized there's something more that could be done with portraiture. I have seen the great portraits of all these wonderful masters, Stieglitz and Steichen, Lucia Nelson. There were so many of them that were marvelous, but they didn't attempt, for the most part, to say this man is a painter or show him in his natural environment, whether it be at home, whether it be in where they worked or whatever. And this was the beginning point. Not every picture I take or anybody else takes is what you would call environmental portrait, although I've been called the father of it. So I began to experiment because after this reception in June of '41 by Modern and Stieglitz, we were offered this show, Ben Rose and I, in September. And I came to New York, and I began to take photographs of all these artists who were so important to me, and that was why I did that. And besides doing other portraits, and I began to experiment. And to this day, I'm called the father of environmental portraiture. But to me, it was a natural step. It was just an obvious step.
Arnold, so in those days when you started doing the people that you've admired as painters and had the opportunity to do the portraits, who were some of those people? And also, who was your favorite, or what was your favorite portrait you took at that period?
Well, so that's the old story about who's the favorite who's my favorite subject or the favorite portrait. There are no such things. You like this picture, you may not like that one, and you continue on. And the next portrait is the most important one you do with the next photograph. They're not all portraits that I did, so it doesn't matter. I think that it's an accumulation of what you've done. I have so many pictures which I'm very proud about. And when I started, I was astonished to find that some of the pictures that I did, but not necessarily portraits, were amongst my favorites, still lives or abstractions and so on. But when I came to New York, when I started the artist, I started knocking on doors because I wasn't sure who was in New York and all of that. I found out. I started knocking on the doors of some of the realists, and I became involved with them, not only professionally, but creatively, but personally. They took me in. It was virtually my family. Raphael Sawyer, Moses Sawyer, Chaim Gross, so many of the realists, Reggie Marsh. And then later I was photographing many of the great artists who had fled Europe because of Hitler, and there was Chagall, Mondrian, Ozenfant, so many of these people, and I was rather startled as a kid of 23. They accepted me as an artist and even insisted, they say, well, we'd like to get some of your photographs. We like it. And I'd show it to them. And they say, can we give you something in return? I never, ever asked anybody before I took a picture that I wanted to swap. I mean, that was not the idea of it. And if I had done so, I would have lost my entree to all these wonderful people. But I was very lucky. I had the original drawings of Broadway Woogie Woogie. I have a nice collage of Legers and so on, and paintings by the Sawyers, so on and so forth. And it was wonderful. I was accepted. The only thing was that after my unemployment compensation ran out after 15 weeks at $16 a week, or whatever it was, I was sleeping on my cousin's couch in Brooklyn. But here I was doing these pictures. I could only afford 8 or 9 negatives. And today, when I think of it, I probably made only a few $100s in odd jobs that year. Today, any one of those photographs, particularly if they're vintage print, run into thousands of dollars, which I couldn't have even dreamed about at that time. But that was the future. My wife says to this day, and all through my 20s and early 30s, I'm still living on the work of a young man, on the sweat of a young man.
That's great. It must have been an incredible time with it. I look around your studio and I see these portraits that were signed by Chagall and the presidents, President Kennedy and President Eisenhower and Johnson and Stevenson and Truman, and just the accumulation of these things. What mementos you have here. Arnold, so where did this lead to from that point? You stayed in New York, I imagine.
Well, I stayed in New York that fall through the spring of '42 when I was called by my draft board. I went home to go in the Army, as I mentioned, and there was such an abundance of 18-year-old kids, and my health, because of hypertension, I was not accepted or told, don't go anywhere because he'll probably call me. And I kept calling my draft board. That was a very popular war. And I really wanted to get into it, but they never called me. I was invited by the Navy, as my older brother was, to become an officer and a gentleman. He made it under the wire. This is all because of what my father did in World War I. But they took one look at my glasses and told me to forget it. And I tried to join the Marines, I tried to join this and everything else. And I just simply had to sit the war out in Miami Beach. But I would keep going back north, doing more portraits and experimental things. Until 1945, I was asked to have a show at the Philadelphia Museum of Art.
Well, weren't you offered a show in New York before this one in Philadelphia?
Yes. So we opened the show in early September, or mid-September. And all the art directors, Ansel Adams came along with Beaumont Newhall, picked out my first print for the Museum of Modern Art. And I spent the rest of that winter all through spring trying to get started. Sleeping on my cousin's couch, living on $16 a week unemployment compensation for a while, then did odd jobs. At the end of it, I got my first job from Harper's Bazaar. Ben Rose did a cover. I did the inside portrait of a woman writer. And then I went home hopefully to join the Army, which didn't happen.
Well then, Arnold, let me ask you this, because people are so used to studio portraiture and not the environmental portraits that you were starting. So how did people adjust, or how did they adjust to you doing this?
Well, the Philadelphia Museum, for somehow reason, knew about my work, because I had now started a lot of portraiture, and I was offered a show called Artists Look Like This. It was in the December '45, January '46, and they bought the whole show. I think it's about 50-some-odd photographs for $750, which was a big windfall for me. But the important thing is that it caught the attention of all the magazines. Life magazine, this is days before television, gave me 2.5 pages. Harper's Bazaar gave me I think it was 2.5 pages. All the photography and art magazines gave it big write-ups, and suddenly I was the new star of that year.
So would you say this is the launching point of your career?
Oh, absolutely. Elliot Ellisophan came down to Miami, where I had my little studio, where I was eking out a living over the war. And he said, "You belong in New York." And when I came to New York, he introduced me all over Life magazine, where he was one of the stars. And they took me aside and sat me down. And the next thing I know, I was offered the top price. They had started out at the lowest one, and I kept my mouth shut. And they offered me not only the top day rate, but they gave me the copyright on the page. Only one of the photographers who was doing regular work for them did it. I refused to go on staff. From that point on, I started doing a ton of work for them, for Harper Bazaar. After a couple of years, I got disenchanted with fashion and dropped that. I began to work for Holiday magazine, which became one of my really, truly great clients at the time. And Frank Zachary, who was the art director and later the editor of Town and Country, had been an editor for me and sent me around the world and worked with me even locally more than any other single person in my career.
Now, after all of this happened, it seems like it's then settled in New York. Now, let me just kind of skip a little more to today, not quite today, but the great portraits that I see of Igor Stravinsky, Picasso, and some of these wonderful portraits that you have, even ones that aren't as well known. And by the way, I must say, the show that you have at ICP is just absolutely incredible. That's a show that you were doing something with Kodak, right? And that they sponsored?
Well, this was part of a big purchase and gift that went back a few years and has been circulating. And we brought it up to date and added a lot of color for the ICP show. And it gives a very good broad spectrum of 60 years in photography, including the very first photograph I took the first day I went out to take pictures of the mother and child. And to me, it was such a wonderful thing to go back and see my, well, I'm trying not to live in the past, but people won't let me. I have to go back and think about that. On the other hand, people are still ordering pictures for reproduction and for collecting them as art. I go back to the very first days I took pictures. It's incredible that I've been so lucky. And I've been doing all these portraits, all these still lives, everything I've ever done, color, abstractions, on assignment so often. And I've been well paid to do exactly what I want to do.
Arnold, tell us something about the new book that you've been working on.
When we were originally working on a book at that time, we deliberately did not go to publishers, although they found out about it, and to my amazement and satisfaction, several publishers came to us. However, it was called to our attention that Taschen was beginning to do this series of small books. They call it a brick in German. And it looks like that. It's not too big. It's about 6.5, 7 inches by 8.5 inches, or a little bit more. But it has 671 pages of color, black and white and color. Sorry. Wow. And almost 800 pages, including the text, which will be in English, French, and German. Now, this was too good to be true because it was going to sell for $30. And we decided we would go ahead with it. They were enthusiastic about it, and so were we. And because of the price, we felt a lot of students and young photographers who were not making very much could afford it. And that was the reason I decided to go ahead with this book. It's book 11. And then if you want to call the latest catalog, that would be 12, and I'm planning my 13th book as an autobiography, which I'm starting on almost immediately.
Your images are so recognizable, so well known. Which of the images do you feel, I mean, you could go on and name one after another, but just name a few of them that are some of your best known images as far as you believe.
Probably the best known one was the one I did of Stravinsky with the piano. And I did it that way. It's not an environmental portrait. It's if you want to give it a title or a description, you might say it's a symbolic one. I hate titles because then you got to do it this way but not that way. I like to be free and do anything I want. The next best one, probably best known one, is my big headshot of Picasso. Then there are some like George O'Keeffe at Ghost Ranch. Oh, there's so many of them because the things keep coming in for requests for purchases. There's Krupp, who put a knife in his back. He deserved it. He was a murderer. He sent too many people to the death. He cooperated with Hitler. And he sent tens of thousands of people to their death, maybe more. And so they go on and on. There's so many of my pictures that people order that I am absolutely startled that they know them.
Well, let me ask you something about that picture of Krupp. I've seen that when you've done your lectures, and you tell something interesting about that, about his portrait or how you wanted him to look, knowing what was in your mind when you photographed him.
Well, the magazine asked me to do it, asked me to photograph him. I said, absolutely not. And they said, why not? I think of him as the devil. So they said, good, that's the way we think of him. It was Newsweek. For one reason or another, they never ran the picture. And I own all my work, all the copyrights and all rights to my work. I don't do anything. Right from the beginning, I was my arrangements with all the magazines. So I've been very lucky. But the point is that, how am I going to do this? In those days, we didn't have faxes. We had cables. We sent first letters, then cables. I got to Paris for other work before I was supposed to go on up to Essen. We then made telephone calls. I finally got up there, and when I got there the next day, I was brought into a small room and said, it's off. I knew his voice.
Well, Arnold, let me back up about this. The portrait that you're talking about, Krupp, that was after World War II. And tell us, who was he, for the people that don't know?
Krupp was convicted as a war criminal. He had operated these big factories, his family, that he actually married into. They were the munitions manufacturers for all the emperors, and then for Hitler, and they made all kinds of guns, ammunition, tanks, and so on. And he was given all the slave labor that he wanted. And people that were able to work, he chained them to their workbenches so they couldn't run away if the bombs were falling, or they couldn't run away at all. And he underfed them. He fed them half the calories that Hitler allowed him to save money. And because he had so many slave laborers that was available to him, and they got too weak to work, he just shipped them off to Auschwitz to be killed. Later he even built a factory in Auschwitz so that next to Auschwitz, all they had to do was walk from there. If they were unable to work anymore, all they had to do was walk right into the crematoriums.
Well, let me step back for 1 sec. You said you showed up there for the shooting, and they said to you it was off?
Well, I was given a beautiful suite at a hotel, which later I found out he owned. My phones were tapped. That was nothing, because anybody who had to do with journalism in those days, their phones were tapped. Probably it happens today, too. Here in America as well, I have a hunch. The next morning, I was ushered. They promised me photographers as my assistants, because when you take your own assistant, he can't speak all these languages, and you don't know where things are when you go to a foreign country. And they brought me into the main offices and sat me in a small room around a table, all the vice presidents of public relations, and they said, everything is called off. We're sorry, you can't photograph everyone involved in Krupp. By the way, what I neglected to say, that he was convicted as a war criminal, and he went to jail. And in our great wisdom, eventually we let him out of jail. We gave him back his factories, his money, his castles, and everything, which eventually he ran into the ground. He was not a good businessman, because before he was simply supported by the government. He needed money, they would give him money, because they needed the arms. So when I got to this little room, this little circular table, these very arrogant Nazi-type people said, it's off. They apparently took one look at me and decided I would not treat him very kindly, which I was about to do, not treat him very kindly. And they told me it was off. And to treat that old German type, saying, I am sorry, and slink away, I immediately realized that I had to do something, and I slammed my fist on the table and said, how dare you do this to me? And they weren't used to having photographers talk to them like that. And they were just absolutely stunned. And I said, I want you to take my photographs, which I had in a little book, and show them to Herr von Bohlen-Krupp, and let him decide, meaning I was bypassing them. And which they did, because they didn't know what to make of me, that I would talk to them. They're used to talking down to people who are below them, and they would practically bow their heads in front of Krupp. And they came back in awe and said, Herr von Bohlen-Krupp, we'll see you. And when I met with him just down the hall, he said, these are wonderful photographs, of course you must do me. And during the next day, when I was setting up, and I found the perfect spot, and I noticed this huge square U-shape casting, the biggest casting ever made, which framed the photograph. I realized it was in a different bay, and I looked up, and there was a rail they could just slide it over to where I wanted. They said, impossible. I said, if it's impossible, I'll tell Herr von Bohlen-Krupp. And they said, okay, we'll see what we can do. And of course, in a few minutes, it was there. We built a 2-meter high platform, 3 meters long, and when I sat him up there, nobody could see what I was doing. I pulled a Polaroid to prove out my color exposure, and I did some others which I showed the Polaroids to them, but I had a hard case 4x5 camera bag or case, and I put the Polaroids in there. And with that, they escorted me back to my studio, and they escorted me back to my hotel, and they said, we'd like to take you to dinner. I said, I am too tired. I didn't want to have anything to do with them. And I will just have dinner sent to my room. They were so insistent, I'll have a drink with you, but then I'm too tired. I have to go back to my room. Later, we found out that they sent somebody up to photograph the Polaroid that I pulled out. Because it wasn't working, and I said, would you lean forward, Herr von Bohlen-Krupp? And he leaned forward. My hair stood on end. It was just the way I'd planned it. But he was sitting back, and I quickly took it. And obviously, we know that they photographed the Polaroid. And being what they are, the old-type German, he was told just to photograph the Polaroids, not to pull the slides to ruin them. And Herr von Bohlen-Krupp tried to get me to be declared persona non grata in Germany, but he didn't have the political clout anymore. And I was able to go back for stories that I wanted to do, but I was scared. A funny story, when I was being escorted out, when I was being taken out, my regular driver didn't show up, and a substitute guy came out, and he took a different route in the middle of the forest. I got scared, and I pulled out my Swiss Army knife, ready to say, stop or I'll kill you, and there it took a clearing. He took a shortcut I didn't know about. There was the airport.
Arnold, since the Stravinsky picture, such strong graphics with a grand piano up and the beautiful composition, and it's a symbolic picture, not an environmental one, and so why did you take it that way?
Well, the symbolic, by the way, description comes after the fact. I just simply had to solve a problem. Now, Stravinsky lived on the coast. He was on the West Coast. He lived in. He was coming to New York, and Harper Bazaar asked me to photograph him. And there was, of course, when I did a book on him years later, photographing him in a hotel room was part of a whole life. Just like you and I, we traveled so much. But it was not the way I wanted to present Stravinsky. I wanted to present him as a composer, and I started thinking I loved classical music. I loved his work, and it hit me. The piano is such a wonderful, beautiful musical shape, and I thought I'd work it out the way it is on this picture. And we found the perfect piano in an editor's house. We took down one picture they had hanging on one wall, and it made a beautiful composition. The piano is a strong, harsh, linear, but very beautiful shape. It looks like a B flat, and it was just perfect for what I had in mind. And at that time, I'd just come to New York. It was one of the first photographs I did for Harper's Bazaar, and Life magazine, by the way, was I photographed. My first photograph for them was Eugene O'Neill. When I came to New York, it was unbelievable. I started at the top. I'll get back to Stravinsky. And, well, he loved it, and I loved it. For some reason or other, Harper's Bazaar felt that they couldn't run it. And thank God I had kept my copyright, my all rights, and that's one lesson I'd like to give to young photographers. Never give away all rights. Never give away even limited rights. One-time use only, period, or else you're giving away your birthright. I'm still taking money in that work I've done for the last 60 years.
Based on that kind of thing and advice, what else sticks in your mind as far as advice to people that are just starting out, if they want to be really successful, whether they have a local portrait photography studio or they want a photography studio and they want to do portraits and they might be in a small village or town somewhere around the world? What do you suggest? What is your best advice?
It's very simple. Study the past, which goes way back. All images go way back to the caveman drawings. Study painting, study the reaction in the 19th century where there was an overlap of painting and photography. They influenced each other. They're both art, if you can make it art. And then work your backside off. There's no other way. You either work in the morning, noon, and night, or if you just feel you're going to become rich, famous, and successful overnight, forget it, unless God has given you the most unusual talent, and even you think you have it, you're going to still have to work hard. It'd just be in your bones if you're that good.
Arnold, also, let me ask you this too. Do you think it's necessary, now of course your experiences, my experiences are completely different than the way they are today, but to your feeling, do you think a photographer has to be in New York or another major city?
Looking at all my friends who are very successful, they're scattered all over America. Some live in Europe. It's convenient in New York, if you can afford it, to be near the publishers, the advertising agencies. But little by little, publishers are willing to give you work, even though you may live in Squeedunk, Ohio, or here or there, but it would limit your possibilities. If you're here, you're able to see the editors day by day, or the art directors in advertising. It makes it a little easier. Or else you'd be just shuttling back and forth to New York to see them, and that's a possibility. I can't give you advice on that because I never had that experience. I found it was better, for me at least, to be right here where the action is.
Well, Arnold, it's been really great and a pleasure speaking with you, and quite informative and interesting. I love your images, and I love the stories behind them. And I wish you many more years of your continued success. And we'll all look for your books and for your gallery shows. And if somebody is interested in purchasing one of your famous portraits, what's the best way for them to go about that?
Go to your nearest gallery, photography gallery, and they will probably have it. If not, get my fax number, look me up and call me if you're that interested. I don't give it out.
Arnold, how about if they email us at the photo workshop and we could forward it on to your dealers? Is that okay?
That's just fine. Then we can forward it to the correct people who handle it after you've tried your local photography dealer.
Well, Arnold, thank you. It's been great to be here. And by the way, thanks for lunch.
Oh, you paid for it, so I enjoyed it.